Hello, everyone, and welcome to Data Isn't Just for Science, 5+ Secrets to Writing Evidence-Based Grants with Amanda Faye Lipsey. This workshop is being recorded and slides will be shared afterwards, so please keep your eyes peeled for a follow-up email later today in case you want to review anything that we go over. In case this is your first time here, this free grant workshop is an Instrumentl partner webinar. These are collaborations between Instrumentl and community partners to provide free educational opportunities for grant professionals. Our goal is to tackle a problem that grant professionals often have to solve for, while also sharing about the different ways that Instrumentl's platform can help grant writers win more grants. Instrumentl is the institutional fundraising platform. If you're looking to bring grant prospecting, tracking, and management to one place, we can help you do that. And you can set up your own personalized grant recommendations using the link on the screen here, and also put it in the Zoom chat in case you need it. If you have any questions along the way, we ask that you include 3 hashtags in front of your question for today, just since there's a lot of folks in the audience, so it's easier to spot those. And now with that housekeeping out of the way, I'm very excited to introduce Amanda Faye Lipsey. Amanda is the owner, founder of Amanda Faye Consulting, and she's a skilled grants professional, health education researcher, and patient advocate with more than 20 years of experience in fund development and communications. Her research has been featured in peer-reviewed journals such as the BMC Nephrology, Patient Education and Counseling, Progress in Transplantation, and the Journal of Medical Internet Research. That was a lot. She has co-authored a book chapter on patient advocacy and end-stage renal disease and a transplant toolkit for ESRD providers available through the ESRD networks online. She's also a recent approved GPA trainer, so love to see that as well. And Amanda, feel free to take it away from here.
Well, thank you, Will. I didn't realize you were going to read the whole thing, and that is definitely a mouthful. So as Will mentioned, I have participated myself in a lot of research, and of course, my main focus is as a grant writer. So I've had the opportunity to be on both sides of using research to support a grant, but also in actually generating that research that we need to support a grant proposal. And so I'm really excited to bring to you today some of those strategies and some insights about how to do that. This just a little introduction, reiterating what Will has said. I've been in the field for a long time, raised a lot of money, GPA approved trainer, GPC approved education provider, and grant professional certified. And I always encourage all of you grant writers in training who mentioned that you're in training in the chat to look into the GPC credential. So today I've broken this into about 6 parts here. We're going to talk about why you should care about being evidence-based, how to show your work is evidence-based, where to find that evidence, how to understand it, integrating it into your grant proposal, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. And I encourage you to ask general questions as well as very specific to yourself questions. I love to really get into helping you problem solve. So let's get right into it. Why should you care about being evidence-based? Well, here is an example. It's not uncommon, especially with federal funders, to ask in the NOFO about the evidence-based strategies you'll use or what the evidence base is for your current program. And you can also use evidence to establish the needs of your community or the need of your project in the community. And we're seeing this more and more, not just from federal funders, but also, here's another example, but also from foundation funders. Is becoming a more common question for you to show the evidence base. And they're asking this because they want to know if they invest in your program, what's the likelihood that it's going to work? And that's based on other prior evidence. So we're going to do a little poll. And I think Celia was going to put that up. Thank you. So true or false, being evidence-based means to show proof that your program or project works. And we'll just give you a moment to click true or false. Just come up with the first thing that comes to your mind.
And while folks are submitting that, I wanted to share from our earlier poll some quick results here. It takes 56% of you 1 to 3 hours to write a grant executive summary, 25% of you 4 to 6 hours, and then the rest are kind of scattered throughout there. And then people's favorite part of the grant application to write, it was really tough and really close, but 25% said problem statement and 22% said introduction, abstract, or summary. So those are the two leaders from the earlier poll from today. And now we've got about 75% of folks responding on this poll. So I'm going to go ahead and share the results here.
Oh, excellent. So about, and Will, just if you can keep, I would love you to keep those other results on hand because I'd like to talk about them in another couple slides. So 70% of you said it's true that being evidence-based means to show proof that your program or project works, and 30% said false. And I am going to break it to you. This was actually a trick question that 30%, yeah, sorry, I know, quizzes and trick questions, but 30% of you were right. It is actually false. You need to show evidence, not proof. And so we're going to talk about what the difference between evidence and proof is. So I want to put that on hold for a second and just give you a quick definition of evidence-based. Being evidence-based means your program or project is built upon the foundation of theories, interventions, curricula, practicum, whatever, that has been tested through a scientifically designed study. A common misconception is that quoting a statistic, such as population data, means that you're citing evidence, but that's not an evidence base. That is, you'd be inferring things from raw data. So to our point about is it evidence if you're showing proof? Is evidence-based showing proof or evidence? You see in this slide here, this image of the target population and the sample size. And this is why we are showing evidence and not proof. So scientific studies are based on a sample of a population. We're comparing that sample to the whole population. So we're making an association or correlation or inference. But unless we actually looked at that whole population, we wouldn't be showing proof. Now, of course, I would say there's always the exception where you might be doing a very specific kind of research that actually very clearly looks at something and you can actually say proof. But in science, we generally would say we have evidence of something and not proof. So Will, can you, for the first question of your poll, can you tell me the stats on that again, or the responses on that again?
Yeah, sure thing. Now let me pull it up actually, and I can just share the results out.
Oh, wonderful. So, okay, how long does it take you to write the grant executive summary? So 56% said 1 to 3 hours. And then 25% said 4 to 6 hours. So we could make a statement from this, essentially saying something like, there is strong evidence. So we talk about the level of evidence. So is the evidence strong, or is it weak, or is it inconclusive? In this instance, we could say something like, with 1 to 3 hours and 4 to 6 hours, you could say there's strong evidence that writing a grant executive summary is a lesser involved time constraint. And we have to be careful about what we infer from data, right? Even that, I would not sure that's exactly the right way to want to say it. But let's look at our second question. What is your favorite part of the grant application to write? So even here, we can say things about that there's strong evidence that, for example, so this is about our favorite part. We could say that writing problem statements and program goals, we could say there's strong evidence that grant writers prefer writing the problem statement and program goals over other parts of the grant. So, but we wouldn't say we have proof that it takes 1 to 3 hours to write a grant executive summary, for example, because our sample size is only the people on this call. And while we're all grant writers, there's still a much larger population. So I hope that helps you understand the difference between evidence and proof, and why we don't typically talk about proof, but we talk about evidence. And that also may help you increase the scope of what you're looking for when you need to show evidence. So let's go through these bullets really quickly. A scientific study means that it was designed to be rigorous and reproducible. Rigorous simply means held to a high criteria. And reproducible means if I followed the protocol you outlined exactly, I could reproduce your results. It also will be, the results will have to have been statistically significant. And I'm not going to get into statistics or what a p-value is, or an alpha, or any, or, false positive or false negatives or anything like that. If you are interested in more information on that, let me know, because I do have some resources and trainings about statistical analysis for grant writers, but that is going to be a little bit beyond the scope. So, but what you do need to know is that you want to look for the words that the findings were statistically significant, meaning it reached a high enough level. And then again, you want to look for evidence, not proof. So in summary, for our first section, more funders are asking for you to show how your work is evidence-based. Evidence does not equal proof, and evidence-based means it's based on the analysis of data from a scientifically designed study. Moving on, so how can you show your work is evidence-based? There's I don't know if y'all have seen this. There's this meme. It's a couple years old now, and it's a young girl. I really should have put it here, but a young girl tells her mom she wants to be an astronaut, and the mom says, "Well, you have to study hard, you have to get good grades, and you have to go to a good school." And the little girl says, "Well, that's just like 3 things." And this slide makes me feel like, well, that's just 3 things. The process for incorporating evidence-based data into your grant may seem very straightforward and simple, but as usual, the devil is in the details. So we will talk about how to find the scientific literature for relevant studies that you need, how to read and understand the studies, and how to integrate that into your case statement or needs assessment, whatever your language is. We look at finding evidence. I often get questions like, we do this program, we do a summer camp, and I can't find any studies on summer camp. But one thing you could do, you could look for studies that show data about your programs as a whole. But the other thing you can do is say, well, what are all the things you're doing in that summer camp? Maybe they have music classes, maybe they get math tutoring, maybe they do leadership training. And all of those things, you could look at the individual components of the program or the project and say, what is our evidence base programmatically component-wise? You can also look for similar or the same demographics, also geographic location, in terms of things that would be relevant to show it. Some different places to find evidence. Some of these should look familiar. Finding evidence is very similar to looking for grant prospects. You want to find a good database that will allow you to search based on different keywords and variables. It's like Instrumentl will allow you to do that, to do your grant prospect research. Many of these will allow you to do the same thing, and they focus, some of them focus very broadly on any kind of research. And then some of them focus really clearly on certain areas. So Semantic Scholar, for example, is a very broad research tool, just like Google Scholar, that allows you to search the breadth of all or any peer-reviewed journals. But then PubMed is very health focused. And the ProQuest Criminal Justice, obviously, there's a focus on criminal justice. So they each can have their own focus. Some of them overlap. And you can find which tools work the best for you. If you have another search tool that you like, that you use to find evidence evidence-based data for your grants, please share it in the chat box. I'm sure, we'd all love to grow our lists if there are any others that you use. Oh, NCES, yes, it's a great one as well. And so, I'll just tell you my favorites. Well, I tend to work in the health field, so I use PubMed quite a bit. I also do like Semantic Scholar. Google Scholar actually is quite powerful. I was a little down on Google Scholar when it started up, but more and more have actually been finding it quite useful. So these public tools that don't require subscriptions, PubMed does not require any subscription either. Now, of course, the challenge can be when you need to get past the paywall of the journal. And that's when, visiting a local library may be helpful to get you access to that. Many of the articles you look for will be publicly available, and you can download the PDF and read it. Another thing that you should know, as a researcher myself, I can tell you this. If you can't get it through the paywall, right? You pull it up, there's just an abstract there, and it says, join, pay $50 a month to get this one journal, which is, pretty pricey. Know that you can reach out directly to the researcher and ask them for a copy. And most of the time, the answer will be yes. Because A, we want people reading our research, and B, we want people building on it and learning from it. So, whenever anybody emails me and asks for a copy of anything I've published, I just ask, if sometimes it's still under this, after a certain time, there's a thing called an embargo. Usually it's about a year. So during the year period, you can't share it publicly, but you can share it privately. So if you email me, I could send it to you, but I can't post it on my research page for people to download. So I would email it to you and say, please just don't share it publicly. Of course, you can share it with your colleagues. Oh, these are great questions. We're gonna I would love to, Will, maybe pause in just a minute and look at some of these questions before we get too far ahead. So if you can't find anything in any of these places, right, using your search terms and how you've narrowed it down, another place to look is your funders, or your prospective funders. A lot of times they will have published recent press releases where they cite research that they find interesting. They will, maybe in their blog posts, they mention studies or initiatives that they're interested in. And you get the added benefit is if you're reading and citing research that they've cited, is that you're further aligning your programs with their own published work. As an aside, can you think of any funders off the top of your head? You could answer this in the chat box as well, that you know of that publish findings from studies. A good example that many of you will know about is Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They publish research frequently. AARP, yes, Pew, good. Right, so a lot, and these are just a few examples, but the United Health Foundation, yes. Kaiser is another one, Terry, in that field. So if you look to your funder, you can see where they're looking for the latest research, and that can help you see where you need to look. If you can't find anything, you can also look at your own preliminary data. Now, this may or may not be the strongest level of evidence, but it is some evidence and you can build on that. So do you have findings from evaluations or assessments? Do you have your own surveys done? That question is really great. Sorry, you guys are asking great questions. I'm going to pause here as soon as we get to the end of this section. We can recap. These can be used to demonstrate an evidence-based, your own preliminary data. You want to be careful with raw data and counts. It can be really helpful to work with a statistician to make sure that you're assessing your preliminary data or your raw data correctly, so that you're not inferring something that's maybe not true or maybe not accurate, is a better way of saying it. But preliminary data works really well as well. Okay, I actually want to pause here. Oh my goodness, so many good questions. Will, can we
Yeah.
pause and address some of these? Yeah.
Of course. So the first question is from Lupita, who asked, where can I get evidence on religious-based questions? So for example, how many people attend church?
Oh, that is a really great question. Um, Lupita, I can't think off the top of my head where you can find that specifically. But I do think it is a good question to use. Actually, no, that's you could use any of these databases really actually to, pop that question in, because there is a lot of research that's done that correlates people who attend church and different things, like different other variables, to look at associations between, for example, attending church and overall well-being, or attending church and how they recover after surgery, things like that. And that's just an example. So you could use, Google Scholar or Semantic Scholar or even PubMed, and type in the variables that you want in terms of keywords. You're going to have it's not going to be something of just pulling it automatically. I'm not sure if the census data covers church membership, but another place to look would be, there are associations, professional associations, for example, that cover like memberships of churches. Like I can think of like the Southern Baptist Convention, for example, and you could look to them to see if they have data on church attendance. Maybe not that one specifically, but other overarching, like the archdiocese, or they may have some data on actual attendance.
Yeah, and it looks like there's quite a few suggestions from the chat as well,
Oh,
whether that's Barna or Gallup, World
yeah,
Council of Churches, so Pew
exactly.
Research. It looks like Lupita's got some direction from there. Catherine then
Right.
asked, as a nonprofit, how do you deal with citing people served data when our internal record keeping has not been adequate?
Say it again. How do you deal with
How do you deal with citing people served data? So data around how many
people?
people you've
Okay, how
served
many
when
people you
internal
served?
records have not been adequate.
Um, well, oh goodness, that's a problem we all deal with, right? At one point or another. So there are a number of ways, but I think the best way that I would deal with it personally is to actually admit that, and take the opportunity in the proposal to establish um, how you want to keep records moving forward, and how you'll use that data moving forward, and explain the checks and balances you'll take to make sure that you get the data that you need. Yeah, I mean, I would deal with it as both explaining the challenge of maybe why it's been difficult to maintain that data, and just, detail how you're going to overcome that to make sure that you, moving forward, are collecting the data and able to use it to show the outcome.
Jean asked, what are the best sites for educational data research?
Um, yeah, I think Eric's is on the list. It's a good one, but honestly, I find that starting with Semantic Scholar or Google Scholar is a good place to start. And then it can direct you more fine-tuned. Some of the sites that I mentioned, like Embase, they may require subscriptions. So Google Scholar and Semantic Scholar are both free.
Marissa asked, I struggle with finding evidence-based programs or practices for food pantry programs addressing food insecurity. Do you have any recommendations?
So I do. Okay. I want to come back. Can you mark that to come back to that
Sure.
later? Okay. Thank
Two
you.
more to go. Owner
Yeah.
asked, what if your evidence research does not support your claim?
What? Oh, I love that. I want to come back to that one too. That's a great question. Can you mark that? I want to come back to that later, because we're going to go
Sure.
through some things and get to that. Yeah.
Last one for now. Christina asked, if a funder presents research funded by themselves, is it okay to use that data in a proposal to them as a funder?
Yes. And with the caveat that understanding there is somewhat of a conflict there, and that you may want to also find something else to support it.
Great.
So
That's
don't
all I
just
got
cite
for now.
them. Okay, great. And we flag those two to come back to later.
Yep.
Great. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me because the next couple of slides are text heavy and a little technical, but I want to get us on the same page about appropriate evidence and the different levels of evidence. So as it says, of course, there are different types and levels of evidence. Not all are created equal, but depending on how you strategically use them, they can all be used to support your case. And we mentioned just a minute ago some different kinds, like preliminary data, surveys are a kind of data, counts, how many people you've served is a type of data. The kind of evidence depends on the study design. We have both qualitative studies and quantitative studies. To be clear, qualitative obviously doesn't have any numerical output to it. You're describing something, think narrative in nature. Quantitative is where we're describing something statistically, numbers. Quantitative data in the world of science is stronger evidence than qualitative data. But don't count qualitative data out. Qualitative data can be very useful in supporting a case. It can also show, and I have an example later on, of where qualitative data contradicts earlier quantitative data, which points out something that needs to be investigated further, and that sets up the case for support for that particular grant. So don't count qualitative data out, even though quantitative data is typically considered stronger. Studies, it's a little bit scientific nomenclature, is that we have observational and experimental. Observational meaning that you don't intervene, you are just watching something. So many things can be observational, that you can, like a longitudinal study where you just record things over time, but you don't actually do anything to the population. Experimental is where you actually, if you're providing a program or you're doing something to intervene upon the subject. Really easy example that we're all getting familiar with is getting a vaccine, right? That's an experimental study. The gold standard for quantitative data, and really all data, is the randomized control trial, where you set up a control group against a group that's going to get whatever it is that you've created, the vaccine, a program, an intervention, tobacco smoking cessation program, or housing program. That's your intervention group. But randomized control. So if that's the gold standard, why wouldn't we always use that to show evidence, right? Why wouldn't we always just look for that? And the thing is, it's not always ethical. It's not always practical. It costs a lot of money to run a randomized control trial. So there are a lot of reasons why it may not be available. In terms of why I said why it may not always be ethical, if you're withholding treatment, or you're withholding something that has some evidence that it works, but you're trying to get stronger evidence, or maybe withholding it would put that person's life at jeopardy, or have a negative impact on withholding this intervention, even though you're testing it, that would be unethical to do. So you have to find some other kind of study design that allows you to not withhold a treatment that could help someone. Another example of a quantitative study is the simple before and after study with a single group. So you have a single group, they come in at baseline, which is the beginning of your study, and you record. So, let's say you have students that are coming in for tutoring, and you have them take an assessment test. Let's say it's math tutoring, and they take an assessment test at the beginning. They go through the tutoring, and at the end, you give them the same test to assess their understanding. And based on that, so you have your before, your pre, and your post, which is the assessment test. That is a very common study type. here are some definitions. I'm not going to read these to you, but your slides, well, they won't be in your slides. It will be a separate handout. I have a full list of probably 3 or 4 pages of definitions of study designs for you, so that you can just have it on hand as you're looking through to see what, if you're ever curious what any of these things mean. But I'm sure some of these do look familiar. Cost benefit analysis is a type of quantitative study as well. Cohort study. These probably are familiar terms that you've seen even in the news. So as I said, don't count qualitative studies out. These can include your focus groups, your interviews, your surveys, case study, or case series. So the difference, of course, is rather than being analyzed statistically, qualitative studies are more narrative in nature. Like a case study certainly has a very narrative format, and they can often be analyzed using this methodological thematic analysis. And that can be where you go in saying, I want to know what people think. I want to know what people think about evidence-based grant writing. And I may ask you some somewhat leading questions that set you up to answer that. Or I could ask even broader questions with no prior question that I want to answer, but I want to see what comes out of a discussion. So you have a priori and a posteriori, which, big scientific words. Basically, did I decide before what I really want to think about asking you, or did I decide after? Another thing you can do in your search is when you go into your database, right? Or when you go into Semantic Scholar or you go into Google Scholar, you can select things like, I only want to look at quantitative studies, or I only want to look at randomized control trials. Another thing you can do, and I highly recommend this, is looking for systematic literature reviews within the last 10 years. A systematic literature review can actually pull all the studies done on a particular topic and give you an overview in one article, and that can help you figure out where you need to start. So it's a really good tactic to start just right at the beginning if you don't know what you're doing, or you don't know what exactly to look for or where exactly to look. If you can find a systematic literature review that's close to your topic or directly on your topic, that can really help you start your search. To someone's point earlier, lack of strong evidence is an opportunity. If you can't find strong evidence, even a case study, incorporating some basic research methods into your assessment or evaluation process is an opportunity for further program growth. So to summarize this section, evidence can be for part of your programs or the whole. It can be the theories that you base it on, or it can be evidence-based for the actual methodology of the program or project. So you can have theories like the stages of change theory, which is for behavioral change, and you're basing it on stages of change. Or you can have an actual RCT that showed that this particular intervention worked. So let's say we did smoking cessation, right? Stages of change theory, we know, works on smoking cessation, and we did a program on that, and we have evidence that it works. Not all evidence is created equal. RCT is the gold standard. Quantitative, generally better than qualitative. Don't ignore the qualitative though. Best case scenario is to use both. If you have the opportunity to cite a qualitative study and a thematic finding, and then also follow that up with quantitative findings that show something worked, that's a really strong case. When in doubt, look to your funders to see what they cite. Another strategy is to look at your peer organizations and collaborators, and don't forget your own data. All right, so we're going to look at understanding the evidence, and we'll break this into looking at a research article and how it's broken down. Oops. So in general, I say in general because this is going to be, I'm going to throw like a totally non-evidence-based stat at you right now. And 90% of all research articles are written this way. I don't have a citation for that. So that's my anecdotal evidence. Yes, about, generally most research articles follow this outline. There are some that don't, and definitely in different fields, you may get a little bit of a difference, and they may come in different orders. So we're going left to right, top to bottom. So first you'll have your abstract. These are generally 200 to 300 words with a couple of sentences explaining what their objective was, what their methods were, the findings, and the discussion. It's very to the point, so you can get an overall idea of what they did in the study. The introduction, this is what I love about research articles, they actually will often follow how a grant might work. So an introduction in a research article is sort of like their case. It's the scientific case of why they decided to do the study and what their goal was in doing it. Usually referred to as aims or objectives, or our scientific aims or our scientific objectives were to, and whereas they may not state specific goals like our aim is to improve XYZ, rather it will be our aim is to investigate whether this program improved math scores, right? So then you'll have your methods. This is your nuts and bolts. It's very straightforward. Exactly how they did it, for who they did it. That's their target population, and their sample size that they chose. When they did it, and where, the setting. So the setting is important to note, because if they did this at a clinic in San Diego, the population is going to be different in San Diego than if you do it at a homeless shelter in New York, right? So setting can be an important factor in determining, is this really relevant, or if I include it, do I need to mention something about that? Findings and results. In a quantitative article, the findings and results will be the shortest section, because in a quantitative study, it's going to be very straightforward. The statistically, they'll give you demographics and participant data, and then exactly what it means. They won't extrapolate. In a qualitative study, your findings and results will be very long, because they're going to go into the themes, what came out of those themes. You might get quotes from the actual surveys or the focus groups or interviews that were taken. Certainly in a case study, it follows a different, somewhat different format. The discussion section is what they think it means. I often find that for me, looking for evidence base, this is often where I want to start. Like, what do they think it means in the grand scheme of things? And they'll usually summarize the findings in less statistical terms. So if you're not comfortable totally understanding what the statistics mean, the discussion will repeat it in a more plain language that you can understand. And then finally, you have your limitations, and these are very important, because those factors that they outline as limitations of this study, it always says the limitations of this study, those factors could contribute to skewing the results, which may mean that this study might not be good for you to use. And I need to speed along here. So I'm gonna speed myself up, get to the end of this section very quickly. And I want to go through more of your questions. So how to qualify research. If any of you have a background in, and I'm assuming since many of you are grant writers in training and many of you have many years of experience, that you know how to do grant prospect research, use a very similar process. When you get your list back from Google Scholar or Semantic Scholar or whatever database you've chosen, and it pulls you back a list of citations that you can then either read the whole abstract or the whole article, you can use a very similar process. You use steps of disqualify. No, not this one. No, not that one. So I always start with, does the title totally disqualify it? Because sometimes the title will just tell you, okay, yeah, no, this is not even close. Then does the abstract disqualify it? Now, if the abstract is vague and doesn't give me the exact information that I need, I'll put it in that, okay, I need to look further. but the abstract may actually fully disqualify it. And I want to give you an example right here. The abstract that is shown, if I pulled this and I said, I'm looking for a quantitative evidence about education programs for kidney transplant patients, this particular article that has this abstract would come up, and I would read it and I go, oh, maybe. But if you actually read this abstract, it tells you that it is what is called a protocol, which means this study hasn't happened yet. They're publishing what their protocol is going to be ahead of time, but they have no findings yet. So this doesn't really give me any evidence. It just tells me that someone's about to do a study. So that I go through my list, this is how I break it down. You may find as you go through culling that a different order works for you. And I certainly am always a proponent of find the best way that works for you. But this is how I handle it. I go title, I look at the abstract, then I go straight to the findings and go, let me read the findings in full. Okay, still good. I'll go back to the methods. Is there anything in the methods that doesn't work for me and what I'm trying to show? I cull down, and then with the ones that I have left after that, I'll read the full article and either say these are the ones that I want or these are the ones that I don't want. Now, the process that I'm giving you is also casting a really wide net, right? You may find really good evidence within just looking for a few articles, and ideally that's the case. But if you want to do full search and see what's out there to find it. Yeah, so let's move along. So just to look at what these look like quickly, this is an abstract. You see here, I pulled out, and here's something that stuck out to me if I was looking for this. It talks about recommendations on early introduction to transplant. Here's an example of an analysis. This is a qualitative analysis using a grounded theory study design. So that's telling me how they did this. They did it a posteriori, which means they decided what their themes were afterwards. Results. This is, remember I said qualitative will often include quotes in the results section. So the theme was they were confused about how to get waitlisted. And then these were quotes supporting that theme. And discussion section. Now, remember I said that oftentimes the discussion will summarize the findings for you in a way that makes it a little bit easier to understand. So here's one instance of that. Our findings show that patients with CKD 3 and 4 are interested in information about managing their CKD diagnosis and avoiding transplantation. And they want information about transplant if and when their kidneys fail. So the big bullets will be in that discussion. So coming back to limitations, why I say why that article may not mean what you think it means. So this is from that same article that we've been perusing, actually, and you'll notice it say it is exploratory by nature, which means they didn't have any specific aims going into it. So it may be less targeted, and maybe the results may be more skewed, or we could be interpreting them in a way that, because it's exploratory, there may be some bias. Also, I've highlighted in here, also the relatively small sample size made it difficult to isolate differences in educational needs and preferences by subgroups. Small sample size is, it's probably like in every paper written ever. There's common study limitations are small sample size and being able to extrapolate that small sample size to the whole population. A big limitation is also, for example, something like, well, our sample size was all college students. So it's like, it's, a completely homogeneous sample versus a heterogeneous sample. And you can't really extrapolate the behaviors, for example, of college students to the whole population, right? So it's important to look at limitations. You want to be careful that if you're using a study for evidence, that you aren't misrepresenting what the study found by ignoring the limitations, or stretching the meaning of the study by ignoring the limitations. So to summarize, I know that was a lot. That was kind of our very technical section of this. Cull down your list, just like you would qualify a list of grant prospects. Don't forget to check for conflicts of interest from the authors. Someone mentioned earlier about, can you cite the funder's research back to them? Yes, again, you want to be careful about conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest will often come up in industry funding. So if a pharmaceutical company commissions a study to show that their drug works, that could be considered, well, that would be considered a conflict, but you may want to be very careful in reading to make sure that it was rigorously done, and that it was peer reviewed. Abstracts are helpful, but the devil is in the details. After you've culled down your list, make sure you read the whole thing. And make sure, as we just said, pay attention to specific study limitations so that you don't end up misrepresenting. So into our next section, integrating the evidence-based findings into your case statement. There are definitely a few ways to do this. I'm going to show you a roadmap that I particularly like and use often. And again, it's not the only way, and certainly not the only way I do it, but it is one way. And I want to come back to Will. There was, I think, the first question I asked you to hold on.
The question that was held on earlier was, I struggle with finding evidence-based programs or practices for food pantry programs addressing food security. Do you have any recommendations?
And there was another one, something about
what if your evidence research does not support your claims? So
one way to look at, okay, that's the second one. The second one is the one I want to do. So let's, I'm going to come to that as we go through the roadmap. So this probably looks familiar, right? Because many of you will have, most of you, again, there's my statistics. It's going to make you really think about when you say many of you, most of you, the majority. So you start to really think about what those words mean. But most of you will have written a case statement or needs assessment. And this is a pretty typical format, right? You start with stating what the problem is. 500,000 people in this country have end-stage renal disease. That's not the right number, but let's pretend it is. And then we talk about what are the current solutions. Now, if your evidence says that current solutions doesn't work, this is a place to say, okay, these are the things that we're currently doing. This is why it doesn't work. It's not moving the needle. So there's one way to talk about things that don't work. And you kind of want to do that. It's good to say all these things are being tried and they don't, and here's all the reasons they don't work. And here's research that shows that they don't work. And then you can pull up more evidence that points towards your solution. Now, when there is no evidence that points to your solution, or the evidence points away from your solution, that's when you want to start to look at all those things about limitations, or were there things that could have confounded the work, or what other support can you show that you should still be doing that work? Now, if evidence points away from your solution, think of that from the reviewer perspective. I'm going to say, well, the evidence doesn't support this, so why should you continue to do that? And that's a question that you have to consider. If the evidence is showing that this program isn't helping move the needle, then why are we continuing to do it? And I know that's a hard question to ask, but that is also why funders are asking about the evidence base, because they want to fund programs that they can see will actually move things forward, and not sort of hold the status quo, or kind of be in a band-aid in a way, right? If we don't address the root of the problem, right, we're going to have to continue to do this. So I would really consider looking at that. And then I would also look at, okay, well, this evidence points away from our solution. Why does the evidence point away from your solution? What's different about that evidence? And for the person that specifically asked that question, if you have a specific scenario, I would invite you to actually, can they unmute their?
I think for the sake of time, I want to be respectful at the top of the hour.
I'm sorry, you're right.
What we're going to do is we're going to try to go through this section and then go through some of the held questions from earlier.
Okay.
And then
All right.
I've shared your contact information in case
Oh,
we don't
great.
get every
Yes.
question in today.
Yes.
So if we
That's
can get to
perfect.
that in the
Yes.
next few minutes, that'd be great.
Yes, thank you. And thank you everyone for your participation has been so wonderful. Yes, if I don't get to it, you follow up with me. I love these questions. I want to be able to give you good direction. So again, you get your problem. What's the current solution? Why doesn't the current solution work? And the evidence, your research that shows why that evidence doesn't work. Evidence that starts to point toward your solution. This may come from directly in your field or other fields that are using something similar to what you're saying, and you want to try it in your field, and then what your solution is and summarize it. Some quick examples of citing evidence-based data. This is one that I've used frequently. This is, I mentioned it before, the trans-theoretical model of behavior change, using this model as a framework. So that's one way of building in, saying you're basing it on a specific model as a framework. That's a way of showing your evidence-based. This is, again, showing this. Notice this section is your theoretical foundation. You can actually incorporate into your needs assessment how you've built the design with the theoretical foundation and cite those theories. Theories can be an evidence base. There's another example. This was a foundation grant. We said, and we pulled this studies that showed research has shown that children with developmental disabilities who spent time in, this is multisensory environments, demonstrated a shorter duration of anxious behaviors. And we were, of course, trying to support that we wanted to build these multisensory environments. This is one that shows evidence current solutions aren't working. Studies reported that students, this was when COVID happened and everybody started doing online learning. And there were some studies right away that reported that these students' online courses were not effective. They felt unmotivated, impaired. They experienced problems with online course platforms. And they just disproportionately affected underrepresented minorities and students of color when learning from home. So that's evidence that these current solutions, oh, it's much better to do online learning. Well, there are some problems. But then they use their own preliminary data to support that these best practices also closed achievement gaps for marginalized groups of students. So they tried some different things and gathered some preliminary data and showed that. This is a really good example. So summarize, evidence can be used to integrate in various ways. You can use the roadmap I provided you or develop your own. Of course, every grant flows differently. You can find evidence that shows current solutions are insufficient and need new approaches. So that's a good option if you can't find anything directly. Whether or not you specifically call out details of the study. So some different ways to build that in, or say researchers found in one study, studies show, or you can actually, simply cite at the end with an endnote or a footnote. And of course, depending on the space needs, just like I'm running out of time, you running out of pages, you may have to go with endnotes or footnotes versus being able to describe in more detail what the study found. Oh, goodness. I'm going to turn this over to Will.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Will.
Yeah, no worries. I've got a couple questions saved. Anything else that's coming in, please do email Amanda at the email that I shared in the Zoom chat. I'm going to go over some of the next steps from here. In case you want to get some freebies, you can submit a feedback form to do so. Amanda has a 50% offer on one of her respective workshops in case you liked learning from her and you want to dig deeper with her. You can skip this next slide and I'll just go to the next part, Amanda, for the sake of time. Next week, we are going to be having a big summer release for our plus and above plans, including our calendar review, Salesforce integration, application cycles, and consultant plans. And so if you go to the next slides, Amanda, I'll just give a short preview for folks about these. But we're going to be having a launch event next Wednesday. If you want to go to the next slide for me, Amanda. And then one of the things that we're going to go over is our new calendar view. This is going to turn your trackers into a calendar in just one click. If you've ever wanted to just level up your trackers or your spreadsheets, this will be something that you can now do on Instrumentl. In the next slide, Salesforce integration, if you want to stay in sync with all of your data, we will have a new integration that will be available to our pro and custom plans. We are also going to have a new release in terms of application cycles in the next slide. And that is going to allow you to track multi-step grant applications. So that's going to cover, for example, if you're tracking towards an LOI deadline, as well as for a full proposal. That'll be available for all customers. And then in the last update that we'll have consultant plans fully released as well. And that's where if you are a consultant in the audience today and you want to set up different profiles for each of your clients and create unique grant searches for each one, and maybe they all run on different fiscal years, you can do so now on Instrumentl as well. And so if you haven't already RSVP'd for our Summer Splash event, you can definitely RSVP there. We'll have a few other customer-only events too that you can definitely check out as well. And then if you want to go into the 5 learning takeaways, Amanda, and then we'll see what questions we can cover from there, as well as some of the other feedback form stuff.
Great. Yes, it's 5 takeaways. Any proposal can be an evidence-based proposal. And remember, you're looking for evidence, not proof. Be careful about using raw numbers as evidence. You want to look for studies designed with sound science and findings that are statistically significant, specifically looking at quantitative, obviously. If you can't find directly related evidence, break your program or project into pieces, look to support components rather than the whole. And you can use my roadmap for guidance on different places where you can seek evidence to support your grant.
Awesome. And with that, here is our upcoming workshop schedule. You can check that out as well in the Zoom chat, or you should have gotten an invite if you're already a past attendee. These are all free once more. And so we'll be back next Friday as well for how to write a compelling LOI with Arnisha Johnson. The next slide has Amanda's contact information, which I've also shared in the Zoom chat. And then you can also use Amanda's Instrumentl link. And I believe that her code actually, it's not on the slide here, but we'll make sure to include it in the final version. The Faye 100 will save you $100 off your first month of Instrumentl as opposed to the standard 50 there. And then in the last slide, Amanda, if you go ahead and submit your feedback form in the next slide, do that by the end of the day on Friday. You'll be able to get that code for Amanda's workshop, as well as our 10 best lessons from 10 grant writing experts. I believe we have time for maybe one question right now. So I'm going to try to tackle Catherine's question, which is, do you feel that research grants should be left to hospitals or universities?
No, absolutely not. And they're not. There are lots of research organizations that are nonprofits that are not universities or hospitals. There are also small businesses that are focused on research. And I absolutely believe that it's hard for all nonprofits to participate in research, but I absolutely think you should be looking at how can you turn the data you collect to show in a scientific way that you are actually moving the needle and what you're doing in the community. The problem of evidence not being available and data not being available is because only universities and hospitals publish, and only they do the research. So it's a challenge, and I would say it's definitely something that more nonprofits would behoove them to take part in.
Awesome. And then one more question is, what would the best method be to quickly read multiple research articles for our proposals?
Find a systematic review. Search specifically for review articles, systematic reviews, systemic mapping reviews, scoping reviews. They will summarize all the recent literature. You want to look in the last 10 years. Older than that will not be as relevant. And they will summarize all the recent research. And from there you can say, oh, I want to read that study more, or I want to actually pull that. And they have a long reference list, so you can actually find the citation and then go find that article that speaks to you.
Awesome. And we actually have time for one more question, which I'll take from Melaine, which is, where can I find statistics about how many military members have pets when they are deployed and need help in fostering their pets while being away?
I would look to, well, certainly I would look at DoD sources. The DoD publishes research. And so I would look to the DoD and see where they, what they've published in terms of stats about military families, also military family support groups or associations. And the VA may also have some data regarding those kinds of things.
Great. And Catherine, I know we had a second question from you. If you want to email Amanda that question, that'd be great regarding the COVID question. And then that wraps up our time for today. So thank you so much, everybody, for attending today. Hope you enjoyed the workshop. All of the feedback forms, as well as slides and replays, will be sent later today. And be sure to join us next week for either our Summer Splash or for how to write a compelling LOI with our Nisha Johnson next Friday. Bye, all.
Thank you.